Eternity is a huge topic. That is an understatement, isn't it? Because eternity is eternity. And when we come to look at it on an occasion like this, there's so much that could be said. I'm rather glad that David's let me go first, because I feel that knowing his ministry, if he went first, I'd probably be sitting there thinking, well, it is eternity, but there's not a lot left to say. So I'm rather pleased that I'm actually able to say a few things before David comes and speaks to us. And I'd like you to turn on your devices, because I'm sure I'm the only one here with print, to the book of Psalms. And just to assure you that old technology still works. The only problem with old technology is that the page location doesn't turn round, you know. On your phone it does, but not with this. So Psalm 90. And I'm reading this particularly because of one verse, but the whole of this psalm gives us some powerful thoughts on the theme of eternity. The one verse really is even just a part of a verse. It's at the end of verse 2, where the psalmist says, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. And for me, when I think about eternity, I'm aware that one of the keys to eternity future is to think about eternity past. Because when we're talking about eternity, it is from everlasting to everlasting. And for the psalmist to be able to say, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God, is such a confident statement. Because every now and then people come up with the question, well, who invented God? Or where did God come from? The problem is that if someone created God, then you'd have to start asking yourself, who created the creator of God? And before you knew where you were, you would be just involved in a mess of confusion as you try and go back and back and back. One of the things that we can say with confidence about God is there's never a time when he was not. And of course we then have to start thinking about stepping outside time, because he is the God who brought time into being. And so when I look at this whole question of eternity and the sense that God is from everlasting to everlasting, there are a number of thoughts that come to my mind, and I found that Psalm 90 helped to crystallize them. In some ways we could say the whole of this psalm gives us an insight into the human journey. In fact, verse 1 gives us a perspective. I'm reading from the New King James, and I realize that different versions will have slightly different emphases. But the psalm begins by saying, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Now that's interesting, because really, if you look at the history of God's people, there were times when you would think that they didn't exactly make God their dwelling place. They weren't resting in him. They didn't enter into the promised land with that sense of entering into rest that God intended. So someone like David can talk confidently about God being his dwelling place, but actually to imply that the whole of the nation was able to say, you have been our dwelling place in all generations, just takes a little bit of unpacking. And for me, I think the thing that stands out here is that whether people realize it or not, there's something about our humanity placed into the context of God's greatness that's really important. And in a sense, just as we can say we're living in a moment of time, because God is the God of eternity, there's a sense in which we're also living in the context of his divinity. Whether we consciously acknowledge him as the one in whom we're resting and dwelling and on whom we're relying, there's a sense in which God's eternity puts even our little bit of life into different perspective. And I suppose as I look at this psalm and go through this journey that the psalmist has here, I certainly think perspective is one thing that comes out. But I also think that in this psalm, because we're looking at our lives in the context of eternity, there's a sense in which the psalmist brings out this whole thought of how incredibly brief our earthly journey is compared with the whole of eternity. And we'll look at that for a moment too. But alongside that sense of brevity, there is a great sense of worth. You see, we could easily end up with the impression that just because compared with eternity, our earthly journey is brief, it's worthless. But actually, we need to balance those things together, how brevity and worth can interrelate. And then the final part of the psalm, which I really enjoy, is looking at the hope and assurance that we have in the face of eternity. So we can use the psalm as a guide, but I've just given you those as sort of broad headings. The perspective, living in the context of an everlasting God. The question of brevity and yet alongside that worth. And then the whole issue of hope and assurance. So let me read the psalm and you can follow it on whatever version you have. It says this, Lord, you've been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men, for 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it's past, and like a watch in the night. You carry away like a flood. They're like asleep. In the morning they're like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes and grows up, and in the evening it's cut down and withers. For we've been consumed by your anger, and by your wrath we're terrified. You've set our iniquities before you. Our secret sins are in the light of your countenance. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they're 80 years, yet the boast is only labor and sorrow. For it's soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Return, O Lord, how long? And have compassion on your servants. O satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you've afflicted us, the years in which we've seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So let's think first of all about our everlasting God. And one of the things I think is really interesting is this. Actually, I asked my grandchildren, I said to them, they've asked me to talk about eternity. What hard questions can you come up with? And boy, did they come up with some hard questions. It's always good to face those, isn't it? And one of the questions I got was, will there be any point to eternity? You can tell that my oldest granddaughter did philosophy and ethics, so is there any point to eternity was her question. She said, because if it's going to be pointless, there won't be much point being there. I thought, yes, okay, I understand where you're coming from. But one of the things you can say when you look at God is this, I don't think God's ever been bored. I know when people talk about the creation, sometimes they talk as if God had to create because he was just bored. Or even worse, he was lonely. This impression that God just felt so inadequate without us. I think that's an inflation of humanity to make us feel more important than we really are. Sometimes people say to me, I don't get the Trinity. I tell you what, I'd have a real problem understanding God if God wasn't three persons in one. I'll tell you why. Because God is love. Now, you can't have love without having an object of your love. So the way we know God is love is because God the Father loves the Son and loves the Holy Spirit. God the Holy Spirit loves the Father and the Son. And you can begin to see that God is love and God has always been love. God is life and God is light. And there's never a time when he wasn't any of those things. God is content. And there's something about the contentment of God which we need to recognize. Because otherwise, when we're looking at eternity, we're not thinking of an eternal rest. We're thinking of an eternal striving. But there's something about God's rest that is such a complete contentment. And I know this may sound a strange way to begin, but to think about what it was like before God created, when God was just God. From everlasting past, he was just God. He was love. He was life. He was light. He didn't have to create light to be light. He was light. And that life that he had was such an abundance of life. God didn't create us because he was lonely, because there was no loneliness in God. And it's this understanding of that pre-creation rest and contentment and joy that God had that I think really blesses me when I think about eternity. Now, I think eternity ahead is great, but it's great because we can see something of the context of it from that which was there in the beginning. I think God created because God is creative. In the beginning, God, and sometimes it's good just to pause, isn't it? 4 words in the beginning, God. But in the beginning, God created. And there's something about that creativity of God. And that's one of the reasons why one can look to eternity, because I don't think God's creativity stops. And when I read some of the things in Revelation, like being led to fountains of water and letting him show us his kindness in the years that are to come, this is an expression of God's continuing creativity. So I don't know how much you can take this on board. I put quite a lot of it in the first chapter on this power of purity, because I just think it's really important to understand that everything that God is, he has been eternally. He hasn't become it somewhere along the way. From everlasting to everlasting, he is God. Love, light, power, purity. That is who he is. It's in his nature. And we need to realize that when he created, it wasn't, as some religions teach, as a sort of emanation from God, because that would have been a problem. You see, because his first creation, when he created the angelic creation, that creation rebelled. Now, if that creation was part of his internal makeup, as some religions teach, that rebellion then would have become part of his nature, wouldn't it? And yet the Bible says God is light and in him is no darkness at all. So the angelic rebellion was something that happened external to God's nature. And we are external to God in that sense that he created us. But he also wants to bring us into fellowship with him. But you can see the creativity of God. It's something that he created out of nothing, and yet it's created externally to himself. The whole phenomenal cosmos, the angelic creation, and then he creates us as the crown of his creation. And yet when he creates us as the crown of his creation and he breathes life into humanity, he doesn't breathe all of his life into humanity, because he gives the opportunity of knowing yet more of his life by placing the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Isn't that interesting? And I think the reason he put the tree of life in the Garden of Eden rather than giving us every bit of life that he could have was because there's something about life in God that comes out of relationship. And I think we all know that relationship works best when it's voluntary. Somehow there needs to be an opportunity to choose. Do you want this life? Or are you sufficient with the level of life that you've already got? So that tree of life in the Garden of Eden was like God saying, there is more. There is more. But in order to make the choice even more, if you like, powerful, there was another tree there. Now, I don't know. This is just me thinking aloud here. But if there hadn't been an angelic rebellion, I think the choice would probably have been between the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Almost a case of you can live by more of the life of God, or you can live by more of your own wits, wisdom, personality, charisma, all of these kind of things. A strengthening of, I guess, what we in New Testament terminology would say, the flesh rather than the spirit. You'd be living out of all of that. But because there'd been an angelic rebellion, it wasn't just going to be the tree of knowledge, it was going to be the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Because there had now been a rebellion and evil was an option. Now the interesting thing, many interesting things in these early chapters of Genesis, but one of the things the devil did, you know, when he lies, he speaks his own native language. From the time he rebelled, he became fluent in lying, and he's still fluent in lying. And he comes along and he says to the man and the woman, he says, if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. But he wasn't right, because God does not know evil internally. And yet from the moment that Adam and Eve ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they knew evil on the inside. It wasn't just something that they were aware of, it was something that they were actually experiencing on the inside of their life. And they were sold a lie, weren't they? If you eat of that. Now, some people think of this figuratively, and at this particular point in time, I don't mind if you do, as long as you understand what it all points to. It points to the fact that if you are not going to live by the life of God, that life which is part of his eternal existence, you're going to have to be living by your only wits and wisdom and the force of your personality. And that's part of the problem. Because living by your own wits and your own wisdom and the force of your own personality and your own human strength and energy is all very well because it has a place. But it was never meant to be the only thing that we live by. And part of the problem is, and I think we're all aware of this, that it's almost as if we've inherited that same tendency to live by the flesh. I know that people talk about the circumcision picture in the Old Testament, but the real picture behind it is that God wanted to circumcise human hearts. But of course you can't do that physically, can you? I mean, if you try and circumcise someone's heart, you finish them off. But actually, when God spoke, and Moses talks about this in the first 5 books of the Bible about a circumcision of heart, he's not talking about your physical heart. He's talking about the forces that you live by. And he's saying one of the things that we need is a cutting back of all of that so that we can live by the Spirit. So you can see that God's done some amazing things right there at the beginning of time by giving humanity a choice. Do you want more of me, or do you want to do it more in your own strength and in your own self? And of course, if you do it in your own strength and in your own self, you're going to know evil as well as good. And the challenge from that point onwards was that they actually died, something on the inside of them died that day. They lost out on that closeness of relationship with God. If you like, level 1 relationship with God, which could have gone up to another level if they'd eaten of the tree of life. But they were living at that level 1 relationship of God, and then from the moment they rebelled, it went down to another level. So that is part of man's problem. And from that moment, also, man's life became considerably shorter. In fact, you can track through the Old Testament and you can see that, yes, initially, although it was much shorter than intended, it was still quite long. And one of the interesting things is that longevity in those early years of the Old Testament enabled what we would call the oral tradition to be incredibly effective. I drew all of the lines once on a sheet of paper to see who was still around when who was born. And it was remarkable because Noah could have had a conversation with his grandfather and found out what Adam had said, almost because there was these long lifespans that gave that connectivity. Of course, after the flood, the lifespan decreased. And then it comes down to 70 years, as is referred to in the Psalm, and an extension a little beyond that. I know that I was at an event at Buckingham Palace when various people were entitled to give an address to Her Majesty, on her jubilee. And she was very amused when the representative of the Jewish Board of Deputies stood up and said, "Your Majesty, we pray for you every day that you're going to live to 120. At which point Prince Philip, who was sitting next to her, almost fell off his chair laughing. I think if Prince Charles had been there, he would probably have looked horrified. But it was interesting that there was that awareness of lifespan. But whether we're talking about 120 years or even 12 hours, compared with eternity, it is brief. 80 years is brief. When 1,000 years is nothing to God, our lives are incredibly brief. They talk about mayflies living for a day. But, what's the difference between a day and 80 years compared with eternity? Which is partly what's being argued here. Writers probably Moses. And it says, we've been consumed by your anger and by your wrath. We're terrified. In other words, he's acknowledging man's life expectancy has come right down because of sin. And there's no point just saying, well, that's all Adam and Eve's fault. Because every one of us has added to the complexity. You can't just blame your forefathers. But the good thing is, because sin entered into the world through one person, redemption can come in through one person. If sin comes in through a representative, righteousness can come in through a representative. So we can talk about Jesus as being the second man or the last Adam who comes in to bring the solution. But the psalmist is right. We've been consumed by God's anger, his wrath. We're terrified. You've set our iniquities before you. God sees everything. He knows the sin of humanity. Our secret sins are in the light of your countenance. Isn't it funny how we deceive ourselves that God can't see what we do? I know he's very gracious. He's of holier eyes than to look upon sin. He doesn't sort of spend all his time gazing, well, what are they up to now? But he doesn't miss anything either. He knows these things. All our days have passed away in God's wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they're 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. For it's soon cut off, and we fly away. It actually says earlier in the psalm, it's like a sleep. In the morning they're like grass which grows up. In the morning it flourishes, it grows up, and in the evening it's cut down. That's what it seems like. But when you start thinking about brevity in the face of eternity, you also have to start thinking about worth. What's our lives worth? Because when you talk like this, it seems like nothing. It just seems as if it just all vanishes away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. And that sense of gaining a heart of wisdom and numbering our days takes us onto a more positive theme. And that's where I want to really just spend a little while. It says in verse 13 of Psalm 90, return, O Lord. How long? Have compassion on your servants. Oh, satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you've afflicted us, the years in which we've seen evil. Let your work appear to your servants, and your glory to their children. And let the beauty of our God be upon us. And then it just finishes with these words, to establish the work of our hands for us, to establish the work of our hands. But before we get to the work of our hands, let's just think what the psalmist says before that. It's that we might let your work appear to your servants and your glory to their children, and let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us. That's a huge thought. Let your work appear to your servants. One of the things that you have to accept when you read the Bible is that God knows the end from the beginning. And so even when you're reading the Old Testament, God is not in the dark about what he has on his heart. In fact, you can read right the way through into the book of Revelation. And you discover in the book of Revelation that Jesus, in fact, is described as the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus actually physically died when the world was birthed, but the willingness that he expressed in that relationship with the Father and the Holy Spirit to say, we will go ahead and make man in our image, even though there has been a rebellion, because there is a willingness to make the sacrifice that will bring the life. Even though the tree of life was removed after the flood, could no longer be found, I get the impression sometimes that although the Garden of Eden was lost, because the earth was comforted, in fact, Noah was given the name Comfort because his father Lamech prophesied the earth will be comforted in his day. And as you know, what the flood did was actually to make the barren earth more fertile, even to the point where Noah, who if he tried to grow a grapevine before the flood, wouldn't have even been able to probably get a cup of wine out of it, got so much out of his that he ended up drunk. I mean, we can all blame him for that, but on the other hand, he didn't know just how fruitful the earth had become after the flood. It was almost as if there was an evidence that the curse was being reversed. But it was only the first step, because the tree of life was no longer there and accessible. The next time you really get a glimpse of the tree of life is on that hillside outside Jerusalem, when Jesus is nailed to a cross. And then we have access to the tree of life in the eternity of God. But can you get this sense that comes across in this psalm? Let your work appear to your servants. In other words, it's almost a case of saying, we know all of this is happening, and yet we've got this sense that you've got a purpose in all of this, God. From the beginning, God was saying, even to the serpent in the garden, that the seed of the woman will bruise your head, even as you bite that heel. So you know God's doing something. And so I can understand the cry of heart that comes out here. Let's see your works. What is it that you're doing, God? What is it that's going to turn all of this? We know that from everlasting to everlasting you are God. And we've got this impression of our lives just being like a little flicker and they're gone. But we want to see your works. We want the beauty of the Lord our God to be upon us. We want you to return. We want you to have compassion on your servants. We want you to satisfy us early with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Can you see that there's an anticipation of the joy of salvation coming in here? And it all centers around if we can see your work. And if we can see that work, we suddenly realize that the pivotal point in history is that moment when Jesus is nailed to that cross. In that moment where truth and mercy meet, and righteousness and peace kiss each other, as Psalm 85 says. When things that looked irreconcilable are suddenly reconciled. When God is reconciling all things to himself in Christ on the cross. Widest extremes come together. Things that looked impossible suddenly become possible. That tree of life that Adam and Eve couldn't access because after they'd sinned, there was a flaming sword that stood in the way. But from the moment that Jesus was nailed to that cross, it was as if he himself went through that flaming sword and opened up a way for us to receive from that tree of life. When does eternity begin for us? There's a sense in which whoever we are, skeptic, atheist, whatever, our lives are still being lived in the context of God. It's just that most people don't realize it. But when you begin to see his works, at that moment in time, that's when eternity can really begin to take root in our hearts and in our lives. And we can sense that beauty of the Lord coming upon us. I know that there is a rest that we're yet to enter into. But I know that from the day you get born again, it's possible to know a rest that enters into you, even though you're yet to enter into that. I know that there's light and life and love that we're yet to enter into. But I also know that from the day you're born again, there's a life and a light and a love that enters into you. And the biggest assurance that we can have about our eternal destiny is to actually begin to get that sense of eternity working in our hearts right here and right now. And it's possible. It's possible because of what Jesus did 2,000 years ago on the cross, those works of God that we can see. But it's also possible because that offer of salvation means that there's a sense in which we can reach out right now and say, I want a taste of that tree of life. Now, of course, when you taste that tree of life, it does change everything. It does mean that you begin to experience the abundance of life that Jesus spoke of when he said, I've come that you might have life and having it all of its fullness. It also gives that moment when there can be that cutting back of sin and self-centeredness, where the flesh gets cut back so that you can live by the Spirit. All of this happens when you give your life to the Lord. And you suddenly see that that's God's intention all along. From the time that he brought humanity forth, he had a redemptive plan. And one of the things that I love is this, that he talks about us as the joy that was set before him. It wasn't that he was lacking in joy. There would have been great contentment and great joy in the Godhead. But in Hebrews it says that he endured the cross for the joy that was set before him. And the question I ask myself is, well, what joy was set before him that wasn't set behind him? If you think it was just the joy of seeing his Father and going to heaven, of course that was joy. But that was a joy that was set behind as well as before. What was set before that wasn't set behind? And the answer to that just has to be you and me. You and me. God's going to enjoy our presence for all eternity. And we're going to enjoy his presence too. That we can know his mercy, that we might rejoice. Well, there are some thoughts from Psalm 90. It opens up a lot of things. I don't mind it opening up things. Sometimes it's good to open up things. Because otherwise we just sort of live in a little claustrophobic environment without realizing how great God is. And to think about eternity is, if nothing else, something that expands your mind. But let it also expand your heart, because that's what God wants to do. He wants us to know that eternity touching our hearts.